Okay, we're running. What page is that? 55. 55? Okay, great. 55, everybody. I checked the video last night, and I believe we were in the middle of 13. Is that correct? We had kind of answered it. We hadn't completely answered it. I think we answered all of 12. Everybody there? Okay, great. So, in your own words, explain how there's no real moral grounds for political or social dissent without the moral law. And so, what we began to talk about is that if there is no moral law, then there is no cause to oppose. We can't oppose a cause for being unfair. Let's just take something trivial, right? Your teacher gives you a pop test. Like you had no idea it was coming. You had no way to study for it. You have no grounds to say that's not fair if there's no moral law. Because saying something is unfair implies that there is something that is fair. Does that make sense? I will never do that. Actually, I may give a pop this one. What? I may.
I will never do that to you, I promise.
Yeah, what happened? I changed my mind. Yeah, we'll see what happens. If there is no moral law, there's no cause to oppose or no reason you can't oppose. I cannot even read my own handwriting or protest anything because nothing is ultimately wrong. So you can't protest mistreatment. You can't protest enslavement. You can't protest things if there is no moral law. Because you must know that there's something else that is right. Does that make sense? So 14, in your own words, explain why we wouldn't make excuses for doing wrong if moral laws didn't exist. What's the answer to that? Yeah, more on.
Wouldn't need to make excuses if no one expects anything different.
Yeah, sort of. What else? Yeah.
We make excuses because we know what is right.
Yeah, we make excuses because we know we're wrong. I do that a lot. I'm really trying until I was 16. That I give it well, yeah, I didn't do that, but this is what happened and why I didn't do it, right? I know that I should have done it, right? If I'm going to make an excuse for it, I know that the right thing would have been to do what I was asked to do. To make an excuse is to admit you're wrong. You never say, yeah, I know I got 102% on that test, but really, if I would have just tried, you don't make an excuse for that. You're like, yeah, I got 102%. You know that you should have done something differently if you're making an excuse. You don't excuse good. Got that? Excellent. Let's move on. I am going to have, and I'll write this up on the board. I'm going to have you read pages 182. So you're starting at the very top of 182, absolute versus relative, why the confusion. And you're going to read, I think it's the rest of the chapter. It's to 193. Yeah, that's the end of the chapter. So you're going to read from 182 to the end of the chapter. And then I usually get pretty good context clues when you're done with that. And then we'll completely engage together as a class. Whatever time you have left, you can study for your test. Your test is next week. Do I have a unit test is on Tuesday. So you're like, well, what are the extra days for? Working on your final paper or presentation. We'll throw in some days for that in intermediate. Beginning tomorrow, we'll begin building it. Okay? Ça va bien? C'est bien. Okay, thank you. Read those last pages and then we'll talk about it. Okay, let's take a look at these engage questions on chapter 7. I am on page 55. How would you respond to the relativist who says there are no such things as absolute morals because our views and behaviors change all the time? Yes.
Therefore, morals are the same. It's just like perception of facts and values. It can cause people to have different beliefs about a situation.
Different belief. People have different beliefs about something, but that doesn't change the moral standard. And I think the example that was given in the book is that that a speeding motorist, just because someone speeds, doesn't change the speed. They might be speeding, they might be exhibiting that behavior, but that doesn't mean the speed limit is changing. Now, if they change the speed limit, the speed limit changes. But then still it is true that if someone is speeding, that doesn't make the speed change. So changing behaviors don't change the standard. And that's, I mean, we can look at that with any culture and see changing behaviors, but the standards still. And I would invite you to think about like core standards, like because somebody murders someone doesn't make murder okay. So there's some morals about which possibly we can disagree, but there are key core morals about which people that are being honest, we don't disagree on those things. How would you respond to a relativist who says morality is relative because people's historical, cultural perceptions have changed throughout time? Yeah.
Just because our perceptions change doesn't mean the moral law changes.
Yeah, the moral principles don't change. It is the perception of the moral situation that changes. For example, years ago, certain people believed that it was okay, and even today, certain people believe that it's okay to enslave other people. Um, but that has always been wrong. And it didn't become wrong in the 19th century when we abolished slavery. Now, somebody's going to ask me, or should ask me, about slavery in the Bible, because there is slavery in the Bible. Two things on that, and this is something that either we've talked about before or we will talk about in this book. The Bible does not approve of everything it records. So just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean that is God's standard. But also, slavery in the Bible was fundamentally different from American slavery and slavery in other countries as well. Nobody could be owned as a slave. In fact, the Old Testament clearly says that you cannot own something. People generally sold themselves into slavery, like it was their choice to become slaves. And usually that was because they were in a desperate situation that they needed to get out of. Like they were in a situation where they were deeply in debt and couldn't get out, so they would sell. So they would put themselves under slavery in order to get out of that debt. And once they got out of that debt, they could be free. In other words, you were owned, and just at slavery, what was called slavery was more an indentured servant. There was a time when that would end, so that it wasn't in perpetuity that someone would be a slave. And generally, they were voluntarily slaves. Yes. I'm only talking about slavery in the Bible. That what?
That's what I meant, like in the Bible, like they conquered
Yeah. So again, that not everything. Like it also, tells us about Sodom and Gomorrah, and God's not, saying that's okay. I mean, in that case, then it's something that the Bible reports, but it doesn't say. And then God said, take them to be slaves, and cut off their legs, and whatever else. It doesn't say that. So just because it's in there doesn't mean that God approves of it. So slavery in the Bible was fundamentally different. But even so, the Bible records a lot of things. It records polygamy. It records all kinds of stuff that's morally wrong in terms of sexual mores. And that doesn't mean that God is approving of that. I'll give you an example. In Ruth, God said, "Don't leave Israel, stay in Israel." And Naomi and put on his name left and went to Moab, and they weren't supposed to do that, and things didn't turn out well for them, right? So what they did there, they married Moabite women. They weren't supposed to. God used it actually to bring about the line of David. But it doesn't mean that God said that's a good thing that you moved to Moab and your sons. It didn't change the standard to not marry pagan women. And so yeah, good moral dilemmas to talk through. How would you respond to a relativist who says disagreement over moral dilemmas proves morality to be relative? Want to take a stab at that? Yeah.
It's like the fact that you're disagreeing proves that there is a moral standard.
Yeah. Even knowing what the right decision is, and even if it's hard, the moral law still exists. So the quandary itself implies the moral law. The fact that you're having that conversation implies the moral law. If there were no moral law, any answer would do. Nobody would say, that's not right. That implies that the moral law exists. How would you respond to a relativist who says that the fact that different cultures have different practices means that they have different values as well?
Murder is illegal in all countries, and just because the culture changed doesn't mean that the laws change.
Yeah. So the moral value is an absolute, right? How it's practiced is relative. So when I go to Zambia, let's put it this way: in the United States, if you see a friend or make an acquaintance with someone, what sort of gesture do we do in our country when you're meeting someone?
Shaking her hand.
Yeah, hey, my name's it's nice to meet you, Dave. Right? That's what we do. That's not what they do in other countries. And I get off the plane and here are these people coming up to me and kissing me on two cheeks. And I'm like, okay, this is what we're doing, right? The way it's practiced is different. But the idea that we're kind to one another and we introduce ourselves, that's polite to introduce ourselves to one another and not just go, yeah, then that's the core value beneath that. Another example of that is, so when we lived in Korea for 2 years when I was in fourth and fifth grade. It was a great place to live. It's a beautiful country and beautiful people. And by the way, I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, but when people ask me where I'm from, I say either everywhere or nowhere, because my entire childhood was all over the globe, and I loved that. My older sister hated it. She couldn't wait to live in one place for the rest of her life. I loved it, and I loved what it afforded me, because I am rarely um, uh, uncomfortable in new situations or with people who are different from me or with people who don't speak the same language I do. I'm rarely uncomfortable with that because that's just the way my life was. And so when we lived in Korea, my parents brought my grandmother along in part so that she wouldn't be alone in Kansas for 2 years, but also they figured, hey, we'll have a babysitter because my youngest sister was 3 weeks old when we went to Korea. In fact, my dad got his orders the night my mom went into labor. He said we're moving to Korea, and my mom went into labor. And he left immediately, and 3 weeks later we were gone. I can't imagine how. Look, if you're one of your parents is in the military, please tell your other parent that's not in the military, wow, I really respect you. I really respect my mom that every 1.8 years she picked up everything in our household and moved it somewhere else, and usually somewhere else far away. We went from Virginia to California and from California back to Virginia, and that's when I was a very little girl. That's when the three of the four of us were very little girls. So yeah, and she never complained, at least I but she never complained. So we went to Korea. We had our grandmother there to be a babysitter. Turns out they didn't need a babysitter. We had what was called a houseboy and a maid, Korean maids, and they loved Missy, and they took care of Missy all the time. But they also didn't have my grandmother as a babysitter because she kept getting invited to all the parties they were invited to. And when they went there, she was the person of honor. She was sat in the place of honor, and everybody wanted to meet Mama. Everybody did. Like she was more important than my father, who was a 2-star general at the time. Why? Because she was elderly. And Asian, just give me a second. Asian countries revere the elderly. They do it differently, but the idea of taking care of the elderly is a core value, right? It's not taking them to the ground. Remember that because you have a 60-year-old. Okay, go.
Pretty horrible.